1912 is a podcast about the expulsion of more than 1,000 Black residents from Forsyth County, Georgia, and its lasting impact on the families affected. For an episode guide, maps, photos, and more, visit us online at atlantahistorycenter.com. This episode contains strong language and descriptions of violence. Please take care while listening.
My grandfather, William Bagley, grew up in Forsyth County. He married out of Julian, and they owned 60 acres of land. It was a farm, but he also had a school on his farm for the Black children.
William and Ida Bagley were among the first generation of Black Americans born free in Forsyth County, Georgia. Both were raised by parents who had lived most of their lives enslaved by the county's wealthiest white families. Together, they built a life their parents could only have dreamed of. Then in 1912, they were forced out of the only home they had ever known. I'm Rose Scott, an Atlanta journalist and host from NPR member station WABE.
And I'm Sophia Dodd. I'm a researcher with Atlanta History Center. This is 1912, a podcast from Atlanta History Center Originals, distributed by WABE.
Since I've been in office, we've had a steady, methodical, but very effective
The year is
increase
1980.
in our commitment
Jimmy
toward
Carter
defense.
is in the last year of his presidency, and Prince is just becoming a household name. Dallas and Dukes of Hazzard are the most popular shows in the United States.
I want my MTV!
It was the dawn of a new age. MTV, Reaganomics, and shoulder pads. It was also the year that Willie Mae Bagley shared her story with her daughter for the first time.
When I learned about what happened in Forsyth County, it was during an interview of my mother. There was this journalist who had reached out to her and wanted to interview her about the incident in Forsyth County. And my mother didn't want to do it. And my mother was nervous, even 1980, of telling the story and this being publicized.
That's Elon Osby, who you heard at the start of this episode. She's the youngest child of Willie Mae, whose family was forced to flee Forsyth County in 1912. Elon knew little about their lives in Forsyth, and her grandparents, William and Ida Bagley, had passed away long before she was born.
I thought it was a great opportunity for her to do this interview, and so she finally agreed. And the journalist came out. We sat on the front porch of my mother's house, and she told the story. They called this group of white people the Night Riders, and they rode through Forsyth County, burning houses of Black people. There were some people who were killed who didn't want to leave, and there was this exodus of Black people out of Forsyth County. And that included my grandfather and my grandmother, and my mother was 2 years old at the time, and her siblings. And they were only able to get whatever they could as far as belongings were concerned on this wagon. And you've got to go. I do remember hearing her say that it was at night, and they had set, different people's homes or their farms on fire, and they left Forsyth County.
As they rode away from the only home they had ever known, they ventured into complete darkness, hoping they would make it across the county line in one piece. We can only imagine how William felt, riding away from the 60 acres of land he had worked his whole life to obtain.
Now, William Bagley was a jack of many trades. He was a farmer, a builder, a shoe cobbler, and a school teacher. And by 1912, he was part of the 15% of Black Georgians who actually owned their property. While this may seem small, Black property ownership had drastically increased since emancipation. During this time, Black-owned farmland in the United States reached its peak at over 16 million acres.
As William aged, from Reconstruction through the turn of the century, he saw more and more Black men and women become property owners like himself. Fleeing his 60 acres in 1912 meant one thing: he would have to start over.
It's an unbelievable story for people to be uprooted, their land taken, everything taken, and they survive and they persevere and they come to the city of Atlanta.
The Bagleys landed in Macedonia Park in what is now one of the most affluent communities of Atlanta, known as Buckhead. Today, the area boasts multi-million-dollar homes and even the Georgia governor's mansion. In 1912, it was made up largely of white homeowners and Black domestic servants who had long since established their own neighborhoods.
There were some other families that came along with my grandfather, and this, we will survive and we will start over. And that's what they did. They thrived here.
This included Dorothy Pemberton, who we heard from last episode. She lived in Bagley Park with her mother and grandmother. She knew William Bagley growing up, who she affectionately calls Mr. Will. The landscape of the neighborhood is as vibrant in her memory today as it was during her childhood.
On the corner was the church. Right on Fall Road, the side of it was Bagley Street, and every street in there was Bagley Street. That was the main street. That's where Mr. Will lived, Mr. Will Bagley. He lived in the very last house. And it was houses down there. None of these were paved. They were more paths. They didn't have gravel on them. They're just natural rock. When it rained, you just had to skate your way through. They were shacks, except the people who owned their houses. Now, Mr. Will owned his house, and Mr. Will was high on a horse because he owned his property because he got run out of Forsyth. And he took the money that he had and bought that property up there, but it was nothing like what he had in Forsyth County.
William Bagley became a leader in the community. In fact, the neighborhood became known as Bagley Park. The residents looked to William as their unofficial mayor.
I know that it was a community where they considered themselves all family. You know, you took care of everybody's child, and everybody took care of your children. They did everything that everybody else did. They just didn't have some of the things that the white families had.
For Willie Mae, who was only 2 when her parents fled, Bagley Park was her home more than Forsyth was. Once she grew older, Willie Mae met and fell in love with Pete Butts, who was working for Clark Howell Jr., the son of the longtime editor-in-chief of the Atlanta Constitution.
After they got married, they lived there in Bagley Park, and they had a store. They lived up above the store, and the store was many things to that community. It was sort of I guess you would call it a sundry store, where they sold groceries. It was also a restaurant. They called it the Rib Shack. And then on the weekends, it was a nightclub. They had a jukebox in there. And people would dance, and this is where people would come and hang out.
Between real estate and entrepreneurship, the Bagleys were able to, in many ways, financially reestablish themselves in Bagley Park. But it wasn't always so rosy. While Bagley Park became their safe haven after Forsyth, they never escaped threats and intimidation from their white neighbors.
I remember hearing my mother talk about the Ku Klux Klan riding through the neighborhood at night. Anything to intimidate Black people and to get them out of Buckhead.
Like Elon's mother, Dorothy still remembers the KKK marching past the home she shared with her mother and grandmother, the same grandmother that had fled Forsyth 2 decades earlier.
They used to walk by our house at night, chant about twice a year. And the one in the front would have a burning torch. And my grandma would be behind the front room door with a shotgun. They never said anything to us. But it was understood, you better stay in line because we're here.
Life was hard for Dorothy's family after fleeing Forsyth. Her mother made $3 a week, and often they moved when the rent was due. But no matter where they were, her great-great-uncle James Strickland still made sure to visit. He fled Forsyth County, too, in 1912.
I knew Uncle Jim. He used to walk from Sandy Springs up to Buckhead to see my grandmama because my grandmama was his niece. He's a little short man. He looked like an Indian, and he had a crooked, shiny stick. He was really old, and he was kind of bent over, but he was a amiable man. Him and my grandmama would talk.
James Strickland was the patriarch of his family in Forsyth County. His descendants start their family history with Lucy Strickland, an enslaved woman who was raped by an overseer and gave birth to James in the early 1850s. She also had a daughter, Laney Strickland, who Dorothy is descended from. Before 1912, James Strickland was well known in Forsyth for having the best moonshine recipe.
They say he made the best moonshine in North Georgia, and there was a special tree that he used the charcoal from. He made his own charcoal to filter his moonshine, and the revenuers got him. They finally caught him. And when Uncle Jim got out, he started back selling his moonshine.
As a popular moonshiner, he was, in some ways, more protected by whites in the county. When Jim was arrested in 1902 by the United States Marshals, who had been pursuing him for years, a Forsyth County judge actually demanded Jim's release, or he would order the marshal to be arrested instead.
Jim's lucrative moonshine business allowed him and his wife Rosanna to buy 80 acres of land, which they called the Old Homestead. It was large enough for multiple generations of Stricklands to live there as well. When the Stricklands fled their property in 1912, they went from living on 80 acres of their own land to sharecropping just over the county line. This included 2 of Jim and Rosanna's grandchildren, Guy and Leola Strickland. Here's Leola's daughter, Edith.
They had to sharecrop, which they didn't get that much. They probably sort of got the leftovers, but they managed to make it until Uncle Guy decided it wasn't going to work that way. We need to spread out and leave this place because we're not getting anywhere. So he advised all his sisters and brothers to, find their own places, which they did. Some migrated to Roswell, some to Alpharetta, some to Sandy Springs, and some to Buckhead, I believe.
But spreading out made it harder to hold on to the family plot Jim Strickland still owned in Forsyth. Many Black property owners, like William Bagley, were forced to flee without selling. However, Jim Strickland was able to use his influence as a premier moonshiner to hold on to the land in hopes they could return, or at least continue to be buried on the family property. But over the years, it became clear that it would never be safe to live there again. After Jim Strickland died, his family sold the property in 1943. Here's Maisie McCain, a great-grandchild who's now in her 80s.
He had the 80 acres there. And when this happened in Forsyth County, most of the land was confiscated or taken by whites at that time. But our great-grandfather was very feisty and stubborn and strong-willed. And he said he was not leaving his property because it was to go to his children. So it was passed down from him to his 11 children, and he sold it because some of the family members wanted their share. But with heir property, a lot of times, you have those who want their share, and that's what happened.
Coming up after the break.
We bring you today to Forsyth County, Georgia, just 30 miles north of Atlanta, which in the past...
And I'm sitting there thinking, well, my family came from there. They left there in this frenzy. What really happened to them?
I know we've thrown a lot at you up to this point. We've interviewed over 20 descendants whose ancestors were from Forsyth County, and hearing their stories is a lot to take in. So let's take a moment to recap. So far, we've talked about the Bagleys and the Stricklands, two land-owning black families from Forsyth County. The Bagleys went on to establish Bagley Park in Buckhead, while the Stricklands ended up spreading across North Georgia.
What we haven't talked about, though, is a black family who didn't own property in Forsyth County. In reality, the vast majority of black families who fled Forsyth were renters. So how did they fare in the aftermath?
Ed and Janie Merritt were renters in Forsyth before fleeing to Beaufort in Gwinnett County. That's also in Georgia. They, like many former residents, operated under a code of silence, too traumatized to relive it and too scared to talk about it.
And it left a lasting generational impact. Here's Gail Smith, Ed and Janie's granddaughter.
We didn't ever go in that area at all. We was already taught we couldn't, after that my father and parents ran off their land, but we just didn't go there. Our fathers didn't talk, my mother didn't talk too much about it at all. So they kind of quiet and kept it to themselves. They wouldn't talk about it. And that was it.
We bring you today to Forsyth County, Georgia, just 30 miles
Now,
north of
for Gail's
Atlanta,
cousin Candace, seeing Oprah Winfrey's broadcast from Forsyth County in 1987 prompted questions.
It is here in the past.
When I got older, that's when I more or less wanted to know more about what happened to my ancestors. Especially during the time when Oprah went to Forsyth County. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, my family came from there. They left there in this frenzy. What really happened to them?
All she had to go off of was a few mentions about Forsyth from her father George, who had already died. Now, he was the youngest son of Ed and Janie Merritt.
As far as my dad talking about what happened, he never did mention anything. Only time that Dad said things, he just said that his family had to leave.
Though we don't know much about their lives in Forsyth, Ed and Janie Merritt still left behind a lot, even if they didn't own land. They were forced to leave the community they had been a part of for decades, and the only world their children knew. Now jobless and homeless, Ed and his oldest sons went where they could find work in Beaufort, at the Bona Allen Tannery. The Merritts continued working for Bona Allen for decades. Here's Gail Smith again.
They made saddles for horses, dyeing the hide, cutting the hide. So that's what my father did. Mostly everybody in Beaufort worked at Bona Allen at that time. Even our families, our uncles, aunties, that's the only job they really had in Beaufort. Where else could you work? We couldn't work anywhere else.
There weren't many places for Black people to work or gather in Beaufort, but right across from Bona Allen was Poplar Hill Baptist Church, where Ed became a reverend, and where other Black residents from Forsyth found refuge there. And to this day, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Ed and Janie Merritt still attend church there, which in recent years has become a meeting place for descendants of former Black residents. Billy Green is one of the church's deacons.
I was talking to a lady, and her mother was a child in 1912 when they got ran out. I said she used to ask her grandmother and them, didn't y'all ever want to go back? And they said no. It was so horrible. Some people tried to go back, and their homes were dynamited. My grandfather, who was born in 1895, he remembers it, and the main thing that he remembered was how they were warning Black people not to go. You think of 1912, you got to go through the woods or little trails, and you didn't know who you might run into, going through those little trails and stuff. So it did have a dramatic effect on the whole area.
Poplar Hill, standing as a cornerstone of the community, extended beyond the county lines.
In 1936, one of the biggest natural disasters of that time happened in Gainesville, Georgia, because they had the twin tornadoes that killed over 200 people in Gainesville, which is just 18 miles up the road. So some of the older members told me how they were sending what they could to the relief effort in Gainesville, because with Gainesville and Beaufort being so close together, we knew the people. They knew those people. This was a disaster that happened to your first cousin and your mama's good friend and your daddy's old drinking buddies. But just the fact that they could send something, to me, is a miracle that they could, they had something to send.
As a reverend of the church, Ed Merritt likely would have been part of that relief effort, paying forward a kindness that had been given to his family in 1912. While Ed Merritt died before most of his grandchildren were born, Gail had some memories of her grandmother, Janie Merritt.
She had the long hair, and she had one braid all down the hair and all came down here, and she kept a clamp on it. And she was very fair, light-skinned. I would just say white persons. She had that little chewing tobacco stick in her mouth, and she'd be chewing on it a lot. That's all I could remember my grandmother. But she was quiet. She was a beautiful woman, and I wish I could have learned more about her, but I didn't.
As the adults who fled in 1912 began to pass away, their children had to pick up and continue persevering. By 1950, William and Ida Bagley, James and Rosanna Strickland, and Ed and Janie Merritt were all gone. They hoped for a better future for their children in the aftermath of the 1912 expulsion, but instead, they entered a new era of land dispossession, the use of eminent domain, which is when the government uses its power to take private property for public use. This practice dates back to the 1800s.
At the beginning of this episode, we met the Bagleys, William, Ida, and daughter Willie Mae, who made their home in Bagley Park, which was surrounded by affluent white homeowners in the Buckhead community. Now, Bagley Park remained Willie Mae's home even after her parents passed, but soon, white neighbors called for the removal of the Bagley Park neighborhood.
Garden Hills is the neighborhood that was built alongside Bagley Park. It was built with running water and sewer lines. As people started to move in, they started to make complaints about conditions in Bagley Park. They had to have outhouses and things like that. And I remember hearing my mother talk about that the white people complained about flies that were coming out of Bagley Park. And so it was Garden Hills, the women's club, that complained enough and went to Fulton County officials, and they decided, okay, the Black people have to go. And so Fulton County either made an offer to these families for their property, certainly not what the property was valued at. And if the residents did not accept the offer, then the property was condemned and it was taken by eminent domain.
By 1952, Bagley Park was entirely demolished. If the lack of sewers was the main reason Fulton County destroyed this neighborhood, well, it wasn't a problem for developing the public park, which had water fountains and restrooms. Now let's think about this for a second. The Bagleys were forced out of Forsyth County in 1912. They fled without selling their property, but still went on to create a thriving Black neighborhood in Fulton County. Then in the 1950s, they were forced out again, this time from Bagley Park.
The Garden Hills Women's Club bought the local church, which dated back to the late 1800s, and tore it down to build a clubhouse. All that remained was a cemetery. The once bustling Black neighborhood was now home to Buckhead baseball, with playgrounds and fields for the surrounding largely white community. Coming up after the break.
White people in the surrounding areas were complaining about like noise or smell or what have you. So it was like, what can we do that will make us more comfortable?
Using eminent domain to take possession of Black neighborhoods for white recreational development is an all too common story. In 1857, New York City used eminent domain to take possession of Seneca Village, a Black working-class neighborhood, to turn it into Central Park.
Black residents were displaced because of, the city wanting to create this leisure place for white society.
That's Monica Goings, a master's candidate at Clark Atlanta University, who is studying Black ontological displacement and making a case for reparations for descendants of Forsyth's expelled Black residents.
And the recreation is typically built for the pleasure of the white community, not necessarily what Black people want, what they see as recreation, what Black people see as fun or something to enrich the community. White people in the surrounding areas were complaining about like noise or smell or what have you, and it was a disturbance to white comfort. So it was like, what can we do that will make us more comfortable, that will give us pleasure? So again, Black people are the victims of white comfort.
Not only is that exactly what happened with Bagley Park, but it's part of a long cycle of displacement for Black Americans, including those expelled from Forsyth in 1912. Now here's Patrick Phillips, who we heard from last episode. After publishing Blood at the Root in 2016, he's continued his research into that cycle of land loss.
The sad conclusion is that for some of these families, every time they've managed to acquire property is temporary. it's incredibly difficult for them to hold on to it and to get the benefits that white families tend to get from, because of course the racial wealth gap in America is huge and growing. And the obvious conclusion from my research is there's no way to separate that wealth gap from land, from property.
So where does this cycle of displacement begin? Monica argues this starts with the original displacement from Africa.
My research is looking at how Black identity keeps getting assaulted through displacement. The fact that we, as Black Americans, were stolen people from one land, brought here to stolen land. So that is the start of our history on this land in this country. We came enslaved. That was our first displacement. So then as history progresses and we try to, formulate communities, become Black farmers, displacement happens again and again and again. And that is what I argue a threat to not only economic loss, but a threat to Black identity, Black ontology.
And nowhere is this cycle of displacement more apparent than in the acreage of Black farm ownership. So between 1875 and 1910, Black farm ownership more than quadrupled.
By 1910, the peak, we were between 16 and 19 million acres, which is a remarkable thing that we were able to accomplish about 40, 50 years post-Emancipation.
But the height of Black property ownership and the quest for independence became a threat to white society. Black landowners doubled their holdings in just 35 years. But from 1910 to the year 2000, Black farm ownership went from 16 million acres to 1.6.
And we know exactly what happened. Eminent domain, urban renewal, redlining, gentrification, heirs property, codified discrimination, and in cases like Forsyth County, expulsions. It's not a coincidence that 2 years after the height of Black property ownership in 1910, white residents forced Black families to leave behind their land, possessions, and community.
Black independence was a threat to white supremacy, to white societies. And so that was always kind of like an ongoing idea that they had to, in some way, shape, or form, impede on that. Impede on Black independence, and they knew that taking the land was the way to do it. White people in Forsyth County were seeing and noticing, this land ownership, the farms, the schools, the churches, basically a visual of Black independence going on. So I think the assault on Mae Crow and her eventual death was just the excuse.
And according to an NAACP investigation into the expulsion, this is true. In 1916, the Secretary-Treasurer of the organization, Royal Freeman Nash, traveled to Cherokee, Dawson, and Forsyth County to investigate attacks on Black North Georgians. He found that following the lynching of Rob Edwards, a group of white men in the county used this to justify the expulsion of Black residents for their own economic gain. Here's an excerpt from his investigation.
As in Forsyth County, the night riders were poverty-stricken, cowardly crackers who hoped by driving the Negroes out to be able to rent whatever land they desired and to command their own price for labor.
At this time in the South, white property owners often preferred to hire and rent land to Black laborers. Discrimination in the Jim Crow era meant whites could legally underpay Black workers and overprice housing. But this also put white and Black laborers in constant competition with each other. With the Black population gone, whites in Forsyth County could now demand higher wages and lower rents.
But this wasn't the only economic advantage to expelling the entire Black population. In the early 2000s, Elliot Jasmine, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, started his own investigation into Black property ownership. He found that of the 59 Black property owners listed in 1912 tax returns, less than half had records of sale.
And he found multiple cases where Black property owners sold at a loss. For Black landowners with no records of sale, those same properties appear again, later being sold by white residents without a clear transfer.
Using census records, we tracked where Black residents fled to after the expulsion. We were only able to identify 11 who continued owning property in the immediate years after 1912.
One of the Black property owners we identified was Morgan Strickland. He owned 37 acres. However, there is no record of sale. Strickland was the uncle of Tony Howe, who was accused of raping Ellen Grice in 1912. Those charges were dropped, but their lives were never the same.
6 years after fleeing Forsyth County, Tony was drafted into the United States Army during World War I. He served overseas in France in Company B of the 514th Colored Engineers. When Tony returned to Georgia after serving, he married a woman named Katie, and they lived next door to his uncle, Morgan Strickland, in Duluth, Georgia.
But any comfort they may have found in staying together after being forced to flee Forsyth came to an end in 1925. That's when Private First Class Tony Howe died of diabetes. Morgan Strickland died 14 years later. He never owned land in his lifetime again.
And Jane Daniel, who survived being accused of participating in the rape of May Crow, experienced her own struggles. After her cousin, Ernest Knox, and brother, Oscar Daniel, were executed for rape, she was next found living in Hall County. Jane married a man named William Butler, and like so many Black Americans seeking a better life, they moved north during the Great Migration, landing in Detroit, Michigan.
But they lived in Detroit during an intense period of racial violence. In Patrick Phillips' research, he discovered that the Butlers were living in the city during the 1943 Detroit Race Massacre, following a false accusation of rape against a Black man. White men formed a mob, brutally attacking and killing Black residents. The Butlers lived 2 blocks away from where a Black man was beaten to death while white policemen looked on.
When Jane's family was living in Forsyth in 1912, they operated their own farm on a rental property. Jane's father paid taxes on furniture and livestock. Dozens of other renters paid taxes on their personal belongings too. The 1912 tax returns don't just show valuations of real estate owned by Black families, but also personal estate.
At the time of the NAACP investigation, the Secretary-Treasurer found that Black renters and owners often had to sell their personal estate at a loss or abandon it while being forced to flee.
Which makes the tax returns one of the most valuable documents in calculating assets owned by both Black property owners and renters just before the expulsion. In 1912, the combined assets of Black residents' personal and real estate was valued at almost $31,000. If we account for inflation, that has the same buying power of just shy of $1 million in 2024.
What this doesn't account for, though, is the buying power of property owners in a desirable area. And Forsyth County isn't just one of the wealthiest counties in Georgia, it's one of the wealthiest in the United States. So, how did Forsyth County manage to go from a rural, isolated community to one of the most desirable places in Georgia? While the 1940s marked a distinct turning point in property ownership for the Stricklands and the Bagleys, Forsyth County was about to experience an economic boom when the development of a freshwater and hydroelectric power source launched them into the opportunity of a lifetime.
On you at 5:30, we are taking a closer look at an all-black town in Georgia called Oscarville.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about this on social media.
Because of the events of 1912, some people believe there is a curse.
If you haven't heard of it, it's probably because it no longer exists. It's buried under Lake Lanier.
This is kind of like the story that I've been told over the last several years.
I've described it as a kind of ghost story.
Next time on 1912.
1912 is a production of Atlanta History Center Originals. Christian Weatherspoon is our executive producer. Sophia Dodd and Samantha Young are our producers. Episodes were written and researched by Sophia Dodd. Our show is edited by Mike Voulgaris with Samantha Young and Michael Petrobon. Content support by Tiffany Hart. Additional support provided by Paula Shagnon, Atlanta History Center marketing team, and Atlanta History Center staff. Studio and field recording by Michael Petrobon and Linda Spears. Music is from Blue Dot Sessions and Epidemic Sound. A special thank you to descendants and participants of this podcast who share their time and stories with us. Visit us in person at Atlanta History Center to see descendant photos and family histories, which are on display through 2025 and can also be seen on our website, atlantahistorycenter.com. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Atlanta History Center, and on YouTube at Atlanta History. 1912 is distributed by WABE. Listen at wabe.org/1912 or any place you find podcasts.